Okay. Bert, we are probably about good to go.
Okay, well, let me, on behalf of Chevalier's Books, the oldest independent bookstore in Los Angeles, 81 years of service to our community, welcome all of you to this really interesting and exciting evening. We are lucky to have Brad Bryan as our interlocutor. Brad, the chairman of the Munger Tolles law firm here in Los Angeles and in Washington, D.C. Brad is the premier corporate criminal lawyer in the United States and a great friend of our bookstore and a careful reader, as you will learn from his interrogation of our guest of honor today, Cara Robertson, who has written a splendid, captivating, fun, surprising book, The Trial of Lizzie Borden, now out in paperback. Can't begin to recommend it enough. It's not just a story of a trial, perhaps the most famous trial before the O.J. Simpson case, with a result that might not seem surprising to those of us who lived through the O.J. Simpson case. It's also a study of America in the 1890s. It teaches you about how women were regarded, teaches you a lot about journalism. It helps you understand how law was practiced at a very, very high and interesting level. So we are really lucky to have these people here this evening. And I'll turn it over to Brad and Cara and begin by just thanking you for your willingness to do this and looking forward to learning from you. So here you go.
Thanks, Bert. Let me start by saying at some point in my childhood, I heard the following rhyme. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. That, of course, led me to think that she, of course, got convicted of these, and we'll talk about how the trial ended up. But Cara, for the folks on the Zoom call who are not familiar with Lizzie Borden, tell us who she was and how you became so interested in her.
Lizzie Borden was a pretty typical woman of her time. She was 32 years old at the time of her father and stepmother's death. She was very active in good works. She was unmarried, which made her unlike the majority of women at that time. But at the same time, there were many, who were also spinsters, as they would have been called then, living at home with her father and engaged in what was generally called good works. She was a Sunday school teaching volunteer, for example, at the local church.
So how did you get interested in her story?
Oh, I think that my father had a book on famous trials, and I remember reading through them. I think it started with Socrates, and Lizzie Borden was somewhere in there towards the end. And then, of course, it's one of the great American true crime unsolved cases. There's something, sort of almost mythic about it if you strip away all the specificity of the time and place. It's the story of this very unhappy family living together in a small space. And it, to me, it has this, I described it as being sort of like a locked room mystery written by Sophocles.
So I think don't we have a picture of Lizzie Borden we could put up? I think we do.
This one shows a picture of her with a pansy, which was her favorite flower, as a brooch.
And is this before or after the murders?
This is just before.
So you mentioned this unhappy family. The two victims were her stepmother, Abigail Borden, and her father, Andrew. Tell us a little bit about who they were.
Andrew Borden was a successful businessman in Fall River, Massachusetts, which was then America's most important town for textile production. It was called the Manchester of America. And although Borden was involved, as a director in various mills, and his family, traced far enough back, had been owners of the mills, he himself was someone who made his fortune through commercial real estate. His first wife, who was the mother of Lizzie Borden and her older sister Emma, died when the girls were very young. And he remarried a woman named Abby, who was his second wife and Lizzie's stepmother. Essentially, she raised Lizzie.
But there was some tension between Lizzie and Abigail, I take it from your book.
Yeah, it's not really clear when this all started. It's very typical for people talking about this, to cast Abby as this, stepmother out of fairy tales, this who is the cause of all the tension in the household. But it seems to me that they rubbed along pretty well together until about 5 years before the murders. In 1887, Andrew gave a house to his wife to be lived in by her family. I mean, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds about the transaction, but it was really to bail out her own half sister. And when Lizzie and her sister Emma heard about this, they were furious, and made it known that they viewed this as money going out of the Borden family and into somebody else's family. And to heal the breach, Andrew gave his daughters a house that was sort of equivalent in terms of value, and gave them a rental income, which they were free to spend as they chose. But it didn't work. Somehow that either raised the tension in the household to something closer to a boil or a high simmer at least, or it was the cause of the strain in the household. But we know that by the time of 1892, there's a lot of tension in the household, and the daughters and the parents are living as separate lives as possible within a small place.
So tell us what happened that day in Fall River. I know you weren't there, and no one knows exactly what happened. But when these murders were discovered, what did they find?
Right. The first thing that people saw was Andrew Borden's body, and he had been killed on the sitting room sofa in his house. And although the house itself seemed to be, according to one of the witnesses, in kind of apple pie order, his face looked like raw meat. He'd had 10 blows to his face. And then later it was discovered that his wife Abby was upstairs in the guest room, lying face down, and she'd been felled with 19 blows. So the really brutal, violent murders, and that alone made them international headline news.
And when this happened, and one of the things I found interesting about your book, Bert said in the introduction that this is a story not just of the murders, but of the times and of women's rights and a lot of different issues. But one of the things you mentioned was the police went out and rounded up the usual suspects. And what did you mean by that?
Right, they had a very specific idea of who would be likely to commit a crime like this, and really they were looking for some kind of insane immigrant. They were looking for someone who was from one of the prominent immigrant groups in Fall River of that time, someone who was Portuguese, Irish, or maybe Swedish. And they actually went around looking for anyone who behaved suspiciously, who met those criteria. Someone Portuguese had taken out some money from the bank, and that was suspicious, so they investigated him. The laborers on the Bordens farm, which was in a nearby town, were suspected, thinking that maybe they had some resentment about wages or something like that. But that was the first line of attack, was definitely to look among the immigrant population, and they certainly thought they were looking for a man.
And why was that?
The nature of the crimes, the brutality, and the use of what must have been either a hatchet or an axe seemed to be crimes that were gendered. Seemed to be crimes that really could only have been committed by a man. Women were thought to commit crimes by poison, if at all.
And when and how did Lizzie become a suspect?
Well, aside from Andrew and Abby Borden, there were 3 other people in the house on the day of the murders. As I mentioned, Andrew had an older daughter named Emma, and she was away visiting friends, so she wasn't in the house. She was staying in a town called Fairhaven, Massachusetts. But the 3 people in the house were Andrew Borden's brother-in-law from his first marriage, in other words, Lizzie's biological uncle, a man named John Morse, Bridgette Sullivan, the housemaid, and Lizzie Borden. And so the police, very naturally, from their perspective, looked first at John Morse, because he was the man and he was an outsider whose presence seemed to coincide with the crime. He'd only come the night before, and so he seemed suspicious. But he had a crazy alibi, kind of out of an Agatha Christie novel. He was known to have left the house before Abby Borden was murdered, about 9:30. And he said that he had been traveling on a streetcar with 6 priests. Now, the conductor didn't remember him, but did remember the priests, and that seemed to rule him out. And so the next person to be suspected was Bridgette Sullivan, the housemaid, because although she was a woman, she was an Irish immigrant. And Irish immigrants who worked as housemaids were thought to be able to handle a hatchet or an axe to maybe to kill livestock or to chop wood. But she's fortunately saved by being asked by Abby to wash the windows inside and out that morning. And so she was spotted chatting with the neighbor's housemaid at the time that Abby was murdered upstairs. So that seemed to rule her out. And so that really just left Lizzie Borden in the house. And so suspicion turned towards her.
Wasn't there some evidence that the house was locked and that it was really only Lizzie and the housekeeper who had the opportunity to commit the murder?
Right. That's the thing that really stumps the police initially, because as I said, the assumption is that, this is just going to be some crazy stranger who's just wandered in with no particular motive or grudge and just killed the first people who he saw. But the Borden house was locked. The front door was locked. The back door was locked. There was a side door where, in theory, someone could have gotten in. But there's also an interval between the murders. Mrs. Borden, Abby, is killed upstairs at about 9:30 in the morning. Excuse me. Well, her husband's out downtown. He returns about 10:45, and he's murdered shortly afterwards. And so that would mean, if we were speaking about an outsider, that that person would have had to have hidden in the house and waited for Mr. Borden to come back. So the combination of the difficulty of access plus the interval between the murders just made it seem really implausible. The house was not a place where there were a lot of opportunities to hide, because it had been a converted tenement house for 2 families. So if you can imagine, just as if it was 2 separate apartments that were converted into one house, so that there weren't hallways, and someone would have to walk through the rooms to get from one side to the other. So you could never really be certain that you were avoiding people. and there were known to be 2 women in the house at the time, and so an outsider would have had to avoid both of them.
So in your book, you described that Lizzie had a very, very close relationship with her father. I was struck by the fact that her father, until he died, wore one ring, and it wasn't a ring given to him by his first wife or his second wife. It was a ring given to him by Lizzie. And I understood the motive for Lizzie to kill the stepmother, but what was the prosecutor's theory as to why she killed, if she did, why they argued she killed her father?
This is their most difficult issue. That, you know, the brutality of the murders makes it seem very unlikely that it's Lizzie Borden, but also the murder of a father is something that they really can barely bring themselves to explain. And the closest explanation they have is really that whoever killed one killed the other. And they were confident that Lizzie Borden killed her stepmother. And then they imagine some sort of a transformation. I mean, it's out of Jekyll and Hyde, or some kind of temporary insanity whereby Lizzie Borden realizes that her father will know that she's killed her stepmother. And because she is so close to him, she'd rather kill him than have him, see her as a murderer. So it's not a great theory.
Now the crime took place in the town of the Fall River, but the case was tried in a different town, New Bedford, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. The feelings in Fall River were pretty high, and the town was fairly divided, and also everyone knew everyone else's business, and so the assumption was that it just wouldn't make sense to have the trial there. And New Bedford had a courthouse, and it had been the site of a lot of whaling riches earlier in the century. So it was the place where the chief prosecutor was from, and that's where they chose to have it.
So there was the lawyers involved were themselves characters. Maybe Lizzie had the dream team of her day. Tell us about first the prosecution team. I mean, this was not just prosecuted just by some local prosecutor, was it?
No, the prosecutor is the chief prosecutor is Hosea Knowlton, who is effectively the district attorney of New Bedford. And he takes it on because the attorney general, who should have been helming a capital case, was ill. His name was Arthur Pillsbury. But Knowlton is someone who's extremely highly regarded. He goes on to become Attorney General of Massachusetts. And for assistance, and also just to split up the arguments, he brings on another district attorney in Massachusetts, a man named William Moody, who was a young rising star. The New York journalists said he dressed like a New Yorker, which they meant as a dig towards the provincial Massachusetts bar. And Moody was also a classmate of Teddy Roosevelt, and he went on to be a Supreme Court justice. Appointed by Roosevelt when Roosevelt was president? Yes, yeah. He didn't serve very long because he was ill, but he was highly regarded. These are both excellent lawyers. And what about the defense team? What made up the defense team? The first person who represents Lizzie Borden is the family lawyer, whose name is Andrew Jennings, and he pretty quickly realizes that he'd better get some help, and so he calls upon a well-regarded Boston trial lawyer named Melvin Adams, who handles the most of the medical and scientific expert testimony, particularly at the preliminary hearing, but then also at the trial. And then after the preliminary hearing, they bring on their real star, George Robinson, who is the former governor of Massachusetts, and who had, I'd say he's the classic trial lawyer type. he had a really folksy manner, really at ease with jurors and able to explain things very simply and clearly.
Jennings, you said, had been the family lawyer, and I found it really fascinating that in the trial, when he presented to the jury, he actually mentioned that he had been the lawyer for the father, the decedent. Did anybody raise questions about whether that was a conflict or whether that would affect his credibility? Was this an issue that came up at all?
No, it's an interesting point because he effectively is testifying for Lizzie Borden in a few places. He's saying that and he's sort of a stand-in as a paternal figure. Actually, all of the team does that. That they very explicitly characterize her as a girl. As if she's an orphan in need of protection. As opposed to a 32-year-old woman who's been accused of killing her father and stepmother.
Well, and Robinson in particular almost conveyed to the jury sort of almost a fatherly approach to Lizzie, didn't he?
Yeah, he puts his arm around her. There's a lot of little scenes of chit chat. The newspaper illustrations show Robinson in various attitudes, and he's often just conferring with her in a very I don't know, easy way, I guess, that all things that are designed to make her seem just like a normal person who's gotten into some trouble through no fault of her own, who's essentially in you might say the wrong place at the right time, but they would say the right place, at home, where she belongs, and just this terrible calamity befell her. And so they're there to offer support almost as much as legal counsel.
So in a trial like this today, it might take 2 or 3 weeks to pick a jury. They considered 101 jurors, and yet how long did it take to select the jury?
They're done in a day, which is something that was very surprising. About 9 hours of work, and all of the reporters really expected this to take about a week, but they managed to find people fairly quickly. And part of the reason is they excluded anyone from Fall River, on the theory that that they would have fewer people who had already made up their minds, or I would say, these are all men, of course. At that time, there were.
On that note, when women were not allowed to sit on juries, and when was it that women were finally allowed to sit on jurors in the state of Massachusetts?
In 1950, though actually I think there was no woman seated until 1951.
That of all the facts in the book, that was, to me, was one of the most extraordinary. I think we have a picture of the jury, don't we? Can we put that up?
It's the last picture. Sorry.
Yeah, there's the jurors. Tell us a little bit about the jurors. Everybody has a mustache. That's one thing that strikes you from this picture.
Right. It's an era with a lot of facial hair. They're a mixed bunch. 6 farmers, 3 mechanics, 2 manufacturers, and the foreman is an owner of real estate. He's sort of the most prosperous person on the jury and is elected foreman, or selected as foreman. The defense seems to not want Catholics or Irish people on the jury, reflecting the biases of the time, and also the sense that the Irish Catholic population was hostile towards Lizzie Borden because the police seemed to really be sort of pussyfooting around in terms of her arrest. There were a lot of people who argued that if it had been a mill hand or someone else like that, someone who wasn't from a fancy family, that the police would have arrested her much earlier.
Bert mentioned the gender issues in the trial, which I was struck by when I read the book. I took just pages and pages of notes, and a lot of them were on the sort of gender issues. If Lizzie had been a son, a man, do you think the outcome of the trial would have been different?
Yeah, it's the, I think it is the question that one is forced to ask when you read about the way that the murders are described, and also the way that Lizzie Borden herself is portrayed. I'm not sure. Obviously we can't know, but I think we wouldn't be talking about this case 130 years from, the time of the deaths if it had been a son rather than a daughter. I think that would have been, it would have been still horrifying, but somehow not impossible in the way that I think this seemed to some people at the time, that it just seemed like it just couldn't be that someone who presented herself like Lizzie Borden could have done something so terrible.
So in a number of times in the book, you were talking about the evidence and how she reacted to the evidence during the trial. She would cry at certain times. She would put her head down in her hands. She would, dab her eyes. And I must say, when I read that, my reaction was that was scripted and staged. Did you have any sense when you went that whether this was real or whether this was something that she and her lawyers had planned out?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I think that there were things that were really horrifying that were not expected. Namely, during the opening statement, it becomes clear that the prosecutor has the skulls of the Bordens in his bag, and there's Lizzie Borden gets a glimpse of it, and she faints. And I don't think that was planned. And it really is something that counts in her favor. Even the Irish Catholic paper that termed her the Sphinx of coolness, which was not a compliment, viewed her sympathetically for having to endure that particular sight.
And after that incident, when they got past the opening statements and they were presenting the evidence, the prosecutors called an expert who brought the skulls in. And didn't the judges allow her to be excused at that point from the trial?
Yes, the idea that it would just be too much. And though, in fairness, it was a lot for the jurors too. One of them became a little queasy and had to lie down. So there were a lot of really horrifying exhibits, including the sitting room sofa was actually displayed to the jurors as well.
And wasn't there some discussion in the book and among the lawyers about a possible relevance of her having a menstrual period around this time, and how did that play out?
But this is a really fascinating point, because you would think that this information could be important, and that there is a pail in the basement in which there are soaking towels that are bloodstained. And so the police, understandably asked Lizzie Borden about it, and she refers them to the family doctor, and the family doctor explains to the policeman that he knows all about it and it's all right, which means that they're menstrual towels, and that there's something that any married man should know about. But what struck me as really interesting is that one of the key points in Lizzie Borden's favor is that there's no blood on her person or on her clothing at the scene, and so these towels could have been a way for her to clean up. But the prosecution makes it very clear that they're not going to present that theory at all. And the only mention that's made of it is when Robinson is trying to explain inconsistencies in Lizzie Borden's statements, or things that possibly were odd about her behavior, and that he uses the fact that she was having a menstrual period as an explanation for that, without having to, explain why there was this bloody pail in the basement.
So you mentioned that there was no blood found on her clothing, and I think that during the defense's cross-examination, they made a big point of that by examining the expert to make the point that the blows were so strong that blood would have splattered all over the murderer. But isn't it a fact that just within a short time period of the murder, she actually burned a dress?
Yeah, she burned a dress on the Saturday after the murders. The murders were on a Thursday. And she claimed, and her sister claimed, her sister comes to her defense in this way, that it was her idea, the sister's idea, because the dress was just paint stained, and she did so in sight, of police who were outside. They weren't in the house and they didn't notice, but I mean, they could have seen. It wasn't done secretly. And she was able to summon the dressmaker and the painter to say that, yes, indeed, that dress had been bloodstained. I mean, a paint stained rather. But of course, it doesn't rule out the possibility that it might have been bloodstained as well.
And there were two pieces of evidence that the judges, first of all, there were three judges, not one, right?
Right. That was a sort of peculiarity of Massachusetts law, that because it was a capital case, a murder case, where the only penalty was only possible penalty if the defendant is convicted was death, that there be three judges.
And one of the judges had been appointed by Robinson, but when he was governor, isn't that right?
That's right. That's right. Another thing that it's hard to imagine now.
There were two pieces of key evidence for the prosecutors that the judges excluded, right?
Right. They
what were they?
Her inquest testimony, which again just gave, in her own words, her movements on the morning of the murders, and there are inconsistencies in there that the prosecution would have liked to have introduced, and then also perhaps even more importantly, Lizzie Borden allegedly tried to buy prussic acid, this deadly poison, the day before the murders. Now, she never admitted that she actually tried to buy the prussic acid. It never comes to that because it doesn't get admitted in the trial. But the prosecution wanted it to show intent and deliberation and preparation. The idea that she had murder on her mind, and if she had tried to get poison, which is a feminine weapon, and then was unable to, and was under this time pressure to commit murders, then it was easier for them to imagine that she then would have picked up a household implement and carried out her murderous design.
Did Lizzie Borden testify in her own defense at the trial?
No, she never takes the stand. Once she's testified at the inquest, and that goes very badly, hence the reason the prosecution wanted it, then she never again says anything under oath. What she is, as you alluded to with her various reactions, her demeanor and her responses to the evidence and responses to witness, are essentially her enacting her own defense. That the jurors pay attention to how she appears in court. She's always perfectly dressed with a little curl in her hair, and how she reacts to the gruesome testimony.
And how long did the jury deliberate before it returned its verdict?
Well, officially they were out an hour and a half, but we know that they were unanimous on the first ballot, and they just stayed in the room because they wanted to look like they'd been deliberative, and they didn't want to insult the prosecutor, for whom they had a high regard professionally.
And what happened in the courtroom after the verdict was returned?
Pandemonium. Lizzie Borden drops to her feet and rests her head on the rail. There are cheers inside the courtroom, and then outside the courtroom, the prosecution congratulates the defense. Then the jurors file out and shake hands with Lizzie Borden and the defense lawyers before running off to have a drink, because they hadn't been able to have anything alcoholic while they were sequestered. And they also take that picture that you can see now, and they send a copy to Lizzie Borden. And she appreciated the gesture and writes them each a personal note, lauding them as her deliverers.
You mentioned that the jurors were sequestered. They lived in a hotel in the town, didn't they?
Right. They had a special area in the third floor of the Parker House, which was the big hotel near the courthouse, and they were kept under lock and key by the sheriffs, and the lawyers were on the second floor with on the opposite sides of the second floor, and the judges in between them. So they were all there, but they weren't allowed to do anything.
Like some of Bert alluded to the O.J. Simpson trial, but like the O.J. Simpson trial, there was an absolute ton of media coverage of this trial, wasn't there?
Yeah, all of the national papers dispatched their best columnists and most prominent writers to the scene, and then of course there are the wire services too that send out reports. And this is covered in pretty much any paper that you could imagine in the United States, and the local color is given a great deal of coverage, and the columnists themselves become part of the story, that they shape the story in terms of they shape the news of what happens in the trial, but they also explain the surroundings, and they themselves are featured.
And was there also some great interest in the community? There were folks who clamoring for seats in the courtroom, and there were folks that were her supporters, and there were some who were against her. Isn't that right? Right.
The police have to install a special fence and gate, and put extra people on duty to keep all the people who want to get into the courthouse but actually can't get tickets outside. And some people make a picnic of it, and what is most striking to the writers who cover this for the paper is how many of those people are women, and that there's a mix of what they call calico and silk. So in other words, all classes are represented in terms of the audience. And there are a number of women who sit in a particular area, and it becomes known as the ladies' corner. And they constitute a sort of second jury. And that jury is a lot more hostile to Lizzie Borden than the jury that she actually faced.
Which I guess goes back to what we said earlier, sort of the gender issues. Robinson and Jennings and Adams sort of played to the men on the jury as almost would you think your daughter would have killed you? Wasn't that part of the pitch they were making?
Yeah, they're basically saying, look at this woman before you, or as they would say, look at this girl, and this is a girl who loved her father, and can you imagine that she would have done something that horrible? And if you believe that, then what about your life could possibly make sense? If you think that this person who wasn't is clearly not insane by the way that she appears in the court committed something so terrible.
Did Lizzie live in in Fall River the rest of her life?
Yes, I've always thought that was one of the more fascinating parts of the aftermath of this case is that she and her sister split the family fortune, which was substantial. Not it wasn't a New York fortune, and it wasn't as large as others in Fall River, but it was certainly enough to live on a grander scale than her father chose to live. And that narrower way of living in a house that was right by this business downtown, what was called the Flats of Fall River, was considered to be one of the sources of dissatisfaction in the household, that both Lizzie and her sister would have preferred to be, as the neighbor put it, cultured ladies. And so shortly after she was acquitted, she and her sister buy the equivalent of a McMansion in the Hill District of Fall River, which is the elite residential district. And that's where Lizzie chose to live out the rest of her days, despite being frozen out of the church that had formed the bedrock of her support during the trial. And despite being increasingly shunned, that she chose to stay there when she could have lived, if not anonymously, but at least not as a monstrous celebrity somewhere else.
And did she ever marry?
No. No, though there are some sort of salacious rumors that it's hard to know. It's part of the myth of the story, so it's sort of hard to know what was really true. She's linked to an actress who it seems was basically taking advantage of her for money. Linked also in the sense of their parties at the house that are kind of belying her earlier church work. And there are also rumors about a handsome coachman who works at the house. But I don't think there's really much of anything to either of those.
And
stories.
the murders took place in 1892. The trial was 1893. And when did she die?
1927.
And
her sister, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say where you're going to go. I found it really interesting. When did her sister die?
Her sister died a few days later. She moved out of the house in 1905, citing conditions of which she disapproved, and that might have had something to do with the rumors that I mentioned. It's not clear, but we know that she never spoke to her sister again, and yet they died very close to each other, and then they all end up reunited in the family plot with their father, biological mother, and their stepmother.
So the $64 million question is, did she do it?
Right. I think we'll never really know. I think for people who are pretty confident that they know who did it, there's still a why done it to the story. It remains an unsolved case for a reason.
And is the house still standing where the murders took place?
Yes, in fact, it's a bed and breakfast, so that if you are so inclined, you can stay there overnight. Either in Lizzie Borden's bedroom or in the room where poor Abby Borden breathed her last. And there's something about the case that I think brings out the amateur detective in people. You'll find if you go there that there's often somebody upstairs who falls down and to see if the people downstairs can hear him or her, because that's one of the issues at the trial is that it's clear that Lizzie Borden was in the house at the time of her stepmother's death, and so could she really have been downstairs and not heard her fall upstairs? These are the questions that continue to bedevil the aficionados to this day.
Well, Cara, that ends all of my questions. I must say, I love the book. I couldn't put it down, and I've already started buying it. from Chevaliers as gifts to many of my closest friends. So I would recommend it to everybody. And now I guess, Bert, we should open it up to questions from others.
Yes, but I would like to ask a couple of questions because I love this book also. And as I said earlier, I had to confess to being surprised by the ending because I only knew the rhyme that Brad began with. And so when I got to the verdict, I have to confess I was surprised. And I also think were I on the jury, I would have convicted, but because the defense seemed implausible to me. But one of the recurring themes throughout this, because you do so much work accumulating the journalism of the time, was all of this craziness about women and body shaming and how the menstrual cycle could lead to mental illness, temporary mental illness and the like, which all of this came as quite a surprise to me. How did you react as you went back through all of these old journalistic reports and see what the thought of the day was about women and their disabilities, as it were?
Yeah, it's a fascinating point. I mean, that there is this real sense that biology is destiny, and that women are just subject to these cyclical periods of almost insanity. I mean, and this is in medical textbooks. This isn't just journalistic theory. And so I think that when you have that background and you realize that that's the view of the medical establishment, you realize how tricky a thing the evidence of Lizzie Borden's menstrual cycle is for the defense and the prosecution. I mean, you would think that the prosecution would want to seize on it because it provides a way for them to explain how someone normal could do something terrible. A woman who seems very normal could have this moment of complete insanity and thus not be responsible. And so that it would be a less upsetting crime on some level, as horrible as it was. But for the defense to allude to it, it's risky, because to remind the jurors that she was in this period where women, as he said, their minds are all disturbed at this time, could have raised these kinds of questions for them.
And you spend a little bit of time toward the end about the sort of historiography and the scholars, I guess I would have to say, who wrote about it and come to divergent conclusions, reading the evidence in different ways. What was the state, by the time you got to sort through all of this, what was the general view among people who had studied this as to whether Lizzie was guilty or not?
Yeah, we always, we always look at things from our own historical moment. I mean, as careful as we'd like to be, or as we try to be with evidence. And I think that, as you said, that the arguments about women's capacity just don't resonate anymore. So that I think most people today wouldn't say it was impossible for a woman to do something like that. So the things that stand out are the inconsistency in her statements, the fact that there was, it's hard to imagine that anyone else could have gotten in the house, the fact that she has the motive, so plus the exclusive opportunity. So all of that, I think most people probably think that she did it, and the question is more, why, right? And then there's a lot of divergence about that. Though I should also say that, one of the arguments that the defense makes very effectively is that the police are basically overwhelmed by the crimes, and so they just have to pin it on someone. And so the idea of police malfeasance, the sort of the miraculous discovery of the weapon in the basement, those kinds of things resonate with some people now, and might incline people to think that, it really just could have been someone from the outside, and she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
It's worth telling the story about the hatchet. I saw it, I didn't see it, it was there, it wasn't there, which alone could raise a reasonable doubt. I thought that was really amusing for those of us who have seen
Yeah.
police at their best and worst.
Right, because they have the police disagree with each other, so that at first it seems fairly clear that whoever committed the crime tried to hide the weapon by breaking the handle of a hatchet and then sticking the head in in a box of just random tools and then covering it up with some ash to make it look like it was dust. And this is the consistent story, and it looks pretty bad for Lizzie Borden or somebody in the house. And then a police officer comes on the stand and says, "Oh no, that wasn't how it happened at all." And the defense seizes on this as evidence of a sort of police conspiracy. And I don't know, Sign might have the image of that if we've got a moment to put it up, of the hatchets all being thrown at Lizzie Borden.
Mhm. I can share that.
It's the third image. Yeah.
Yeah, I can share the image, and while I get that up, we have a question from the audience. And like, speaking of like all these little details and how they were like dramatized in the news at the time, like how do you feel like this would translate into a movie? Right. Well,
Welcome to Hollywood.
There've been a number of dramatizations of it, and what struck me in seeing them, because they count as research, is that they all have to add a romance for Lizzie Borden to make it seem like to give her sort of a suitable motive, some kind of thwarted passion. There you see the police just picking up hatchets and axes and throwing them at Lizzie Borden because there are a number of different axes and hatchets that are presented at the trial as being, potentially the murder weapon. Although the police are pretty confident that they had the right one. Anyway, I'm sorry. As to the film, I think I'm a lawyer, right? So for me, the drama is in the proceedings and the lawyers as characters, and watching the reaction of the audience and the jurors, rather than the timeline of the murders. That's something that often it just focuses on the murders rather than the trial.
We have another question from the audience too, and we also have one more image that I am going to show we didn't get to. But
right. Well, that also gets to the point of the way in which people were just following this at home. I was trying to, I picked that one because that was in the Boston Globe, and it shows how close the houses are to each other. The Borden house is the one in the middle, marked 1, Roman numeral 1. But it also, as the title suggests, directs the reader to cut this out so that they can keep it and then follow the events of the trial, and then trace the potential strangers who were seen in the vicinity, or where the various witnesses live, vis-a-vis the murder house.
I feel like that I'm blown away that it says cut this out and keep, and how kind of like interactive they were making this trial, which kind of goes into this next question we have from the audience, which was like, they say the public opinion seemed to really change during the trials. Like during the trial, they were kind of like, there were people who were like really pro Lizzie. There were other people who were distancing. And then you mentioned that after the trial was over, everyone seemed to distance from her. And it's like, what do you make of this like seeming shift in the public opinion?
Yeah, it's less uniform than that, that makes it sound, in that there's always a split in Fall River between the Irish Catholic papers and the papers that are from the Protestant establishment. The Irish Catholic paper is pretty hostile to Lizzie Borden from the beginning, and then the farther out you go, there's more sympathy for Lizzie Borden, or it seems she's painted at least in a way that that makes her a much more sympathetic figure. And then I think at the end, the issue is, once she's acquitted, then that means that the murderer is still out there. And if she didn't do it, then who did it? And so then that becomes something that people start to really wonder about. And the assumption as the drama fades, as the drama of the actual trial and the spectacle of this woman who seems like a pretty normal character, and in some respects, someone who checks all the boxes of proper late 19th century middle class womanhood. Once she's no longer in jeopardy, then the question is, who killed the Bordens? And the Irish Catholic paper actually runs a editorial every year on August 4th, say, with all sorts of sarcastic commentary, like maybe it was heat stroke, and this continues for a while until the local bishop tells them to cut it out.
I was going to ask that question. Does Lizzie remain in the media eye for some time after the trial, or does she fade from the public eye?
She fades with occasional, unwelcome returns. So sometimes it's because there's an anniversary or someone involved in the trial has died, but also she's accused of shoplifting in 1897. And so that brings the story back up. It's a little bit of a complicated story, but it is something that brings her to the attention of the public again. And then obviously her death resurrects the story. But as you pointed out at the beginning, she's immortalized in rhyme pretty quickly. And apparently that tune that Lizzie Borden took an axe is supposed to be sung to the tune of Ta Ra Ra Boom Die, which I won't do.
So in the interest of time here, let me thank Brad and Cara for this really interesting, wonderful evening. It's a book that I really, really think everybody would enjoy. It has a kind of Michael Connelly, John Grisham feel to it as you read it, especially if you're like me and you didn't know how it was going to end, which is a little embarrassing, as I have said. There's a lot of this capturing of the time, which I found fantastic. And to read the closing arguments of these lawyers, and in particular the defense lawyer, put me in mind of the Simpson trial. And it was just short of, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit kind of logic. And I just thought it was terrific. It's beautifully written. I know Cara is a recovering lawyer, but it doesn't read in any way as though it was written by a lawyer. It was written by somebody who is a storyteller. And this is just one wonderful, interesting, terrific story. So thank you both for doing this. Cara, thank you so much for spending time writing this book over 20 years. And I hope people will buy it at Chevalier's Books, because it's a book worth reading and having. So thanks again to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat as well.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Have a good night, everybody.